In the beginning, man believed flight to be the privilege of mythological gods. The gods of Crete, of Egypt, of Assyria, and of Greece. As man's capabilities developed, so developed his power to dream of his own ability to fly. Leonardo da Vinci, whose genius stands in marked contrast to the ideas of his contemporaries. If it were not for the dreams in his fertile mind and the dreams in the minds of generations that followed, there would have been no tomorrow. Throughout history, throughout the world, the achievement of sustained, controlled, and powered flight eluded man. The dream was there, but never fulfilled. Sir George Cayley, with his revolutionary wing designs, solved the problems of lift. Steam and clockwork planes followed in 1857. Mosaiski's 1884 steam plane almost succeeded. Then, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew and created fresh dreams in the minds of the young. From the dawn of history, people have dreamed of being able to fly like the birds. But how? Leonardo da Vinci planned a flying machine based on his anatomical drawings of birds' wings, and King Kai of Persia dreamed of flying with tethered eagles. In our own century, the birdman is still with us.
Folks, here I am with a new device called the ornithopter. This device, I expect to attain flight in the air. Through a system of leverage advantage, plus a man's physical power, I believe it's possible to fly as a bird. And here I am, you can look this device over. It appears heavy, it's light.
Willard E. Blaine was not alone in disaster. Towards the end of the 9th century, Mallory tells of Bladud, an English earl, who met a similar fate. Bath was by Bladud to perfection brought, by necromantic arts to fly he sought. As from a tower he thought to scale the sky, he brake his neck, because he soared too high. The first use of cinematography had been to study the movements of the horse, and it was the slow-motion camera that enabled Erich von Holst of Göttingen University to analyze first the flight of seagulls, and then to produce a series of rubber-powered models based on his studies. He went on to film the aerodynamic and inertia forces on various insects tied into a wind stream. The brimstone butterfly and its flying model. And the dragonfly, which enabled him to produce a model of a thrust wing capable of both level and vertical flight. But it was to be a lighter-than-air machine that was to give the human race its first recorded flight. The Montgolfier brothers designed a balloon which took off and flew over Paris on the 21st of November, 1783. The hot air balloon is still with us today. What was lacking in the 18th century was a suitable power plant that could lead to the airship or aeroplane. It was to be another century before that would come about. Otto Lilienthal had been experimenting in Germany with gliders and even had a hill built for himself outside Berlin. news of his work had reached the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. Sir Hiram Maxim's 360 horsepower triplane made a very short hop in 1894, as did Clement Ader's craft Aole. But it was to be the Wright brothers, with their careful scientific approach, who first flew in December of 1903. Sadly, aviation in America was reduced to a circus sideshow. But in France, the new science of aeronautics was taken more seriously. Suddenly, everyone was flying crazy. All kinds of designs came and went, and within 10 years, developments had moved from flights of just a few seconds to the first monoplane airliner. Then came the Great War. The generals on both sides failed to see the potential of the aeroplane, though a Jesuit priest, Francesco Lana Terzi, had written as early as 1670, "For who sees not that no city can be secure against attack, since our ship may at any time be placed directly over it, and descending down may discharge soldiers. It may set over them till our men burn their ships with fireworks and fireballs. And this they may do, not only to ships, but to great buildings, castles, cities, with such security that they which cast these things down from a height out of gunshot cannot on the other side be offended by those from below." The Bristol fighter was to be the peak of this wartime development. The problem for the designers was not the fighter, but the bomber. In Britain, they produced the Tabor, which was 30 feet longer than the Lancaster. Italy produced the underpowered Caproni 42. The United States, the John multiplane, with its 7 wings, and the Barling bomber by the same designer as the Tabor. Bristol Aircraft, who had produced the highly successful fighter, came up with the Braemar, so large that it had to come out of its Filton hangar sideways. Built as a heavy bomber, it first flew in August 1918. With the end of hostilities in November, the newly founded Royal Air Force found itself with a surplus of combat aircraft, and thoughts turned to converting the Braemar into a 14-seater transport. So a second aircraft was produced and named the Pullman. After a few flights, it was broken up, and with it, the dream of the multiplane. Designers returned to the biplane, and Bristol produced a 10-seater, which made its first flight in June 1921. It was leased for a time to Handley Page Transport for use on the London to Paris route. There were hopes of orders from Imperial Airways, but they had adopted a policy of multi-engined aeroplanes, and so the 10-seater joined the list of projects cancelled. The 1920s and 30s was a time when the individual could still make his mark in aviation. It was possible, with limited capital, great enthusiasm, and one of the cheap war surplus engines, to make a flying machine in the backyard.
Here you see another type helicopter or direct lift air machine. Our principle, as you will see, is a flat plate or disc type propeller moving the air fast enough to produce a lift. Our engine is connected to our transmission by a jack shaft driven by a chain. Our transmission rotates and reciprocates our propeller. As the propeller goes up, we get our lifting power on the down reciprocation.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll show you how this works.
here with a 3-wheel landing gear. Any kind of a landing is perfectly all right, frontwards or sideways, one wheel, or any other way that you wish. The GB ascender steers with a wheel instead of the conventional rudder bar, both in the air and on the ground. Similar to this. The flippers are handled by the fore and aft motion of the stick and the ailerons by the side motion. The throttle is directly behind the wheel like a Model T Ford. All right, Andy, let's go.
D.T. Granville did get off the ground and proved what could be done with imagination and limited resources. Dr. Snyder's flying wing, based on the butterfly, was an attempt to produce a cheap family aeroplane, a Model T Ford of the sky. New York inventor I.C. Popper decided to do away with wings altogether.
In place of wings, we use spindles on this ship. The large ones are the main lifters, and the small ones act as stabilizers. This is done by spiraling so that the landing with speed would be about 5 to 10 miles per hour.
The idea behind Popper's invention was that the revolving drums would produce a vacuum, thereby creating lift.
Engineers predict the spindles will be more efficient than the wings of an airplane.
There is no record of the craft ever leaving the ground.
She hasn't flown yet, but who can say she won't?
This small crop sprayer, with its rear engine, unusual controls and wing shape, looked at the time to have a successful career ahead of it. The single circular wing was another attempt to produce a plane with short takeoff and landing characteristics. It was overshadowed by the autogyro, and later the helicopter. This small flying wing with only a 30-foot length was an idea that was to be taken up again in the 1940s with the early jet aircraft. The aircraft industry was involved in many experiments to do with control surfaces. In France, Vicol de Rouge, with his Electroplane, probably set a record for the greatest number on one aircraft. Italian engineers in Milan produced the Flying Barrel, an engine shape that is returning in the 1980s with the new generation of prop jets. The body shape was more of a problem. A similar shape had been used by 5 farm workers in Springfield, Ohio, to house the new large radial engines in their plane, the GB. Built in just 6 weeks, they had produced the fastest and one of the most unstable planes in the world.
Gene fails in his power-packed speedster, the GB, caught by the camera in an unforgettable shot as it breaks into flames above the airfield. Burning wreckage is his monument.
Every GB that was built crashed. In a return to first principles, Vincenz Chalupsky in Czechoslovakia produced an oxygen-powered model of a bird aeroplane. The obsession to possess wings was still there. One of the more forlorn attempts was by Jack Cohen on his rocket-assisted winged bicycle. An event staged mainly for the ever-hungry newsreel cameras. At the time George Struss took his frail-looking craft into the air at Cokesville, Pennsylvania, long odds had been laid against it flying. But it did, some 50 years before the microlight caught the public imagination. Towards the end of the 1930s, the great era of private experiments was drawing to a close. Tighter construction laws, more stringent flying regulations, and increasing costs meant that the age of the back garden inventor was over. The Second World War loomed, and it was to be the turn of the large manufacturers to make mistakes. Some of them on a monumental scale. During 1940, Hitler laid plans for the invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Part of the plan called for the use of airborne forces. The Messerschmitt Company was asked to produce a giant glider capable not only of carrying troops, but also a 12-ton tank. The company was given just 2 weeks to produce a design. They came up with the Gigant. Apart from its size, it was a conventional glider. It was made of welded steel tube covered with fabric and a part wooden framed wing. In just 14 weeks, the first craft was rolled out. It was the second largest aircraft in the world. The one lasting feature about the Gigant was to be its nose doors, since used on countless air freighters. The problem was not so much with the glider, but with the tug. No single German aircraft had enough power, and so the early flights were undertaken by 3 Me-110s, with the help of rockets under the Gigant's wings. It was not a success. There were many fatal accidents. Eventually, they were to install up to 6 engines, but this merely produced a slow, heavy aircraft, very vulnerable to Allied fighters. Towards the end of the war, Germany produced some advanced jet aircraft. all of which were to be taken over by the Allies and incorporated into their jet programs. Foremost amongst the causes of Germany's defeat had been the destruction of their air force. One of the Allied planes that had contributed most to this was the Spitfire. It was a development of the S-6B designed by R.J. Mitchell and built by the Supermarine Company. The S-6B had not only won the Schneider Trophy outright, but also set a new absolute world speed record of 407 miles per hour. Over 20,000 Spitfires were built, and it seemed a natural development that post-war Supermarine should be asked to produce a jet fighter for the RAF. Supermarine had produced a plane for the Royal Navy, the Attacker, and it was decided to develop a swept-wing version for the RAF as an interim measure before the arrival of the supersonic fighter. They produced the Type 510, later to be called the Swift. From the start, too much was asked of it. It was expected to have high speed, large fuel reserves, afterburners, power controls, and to carry the new 30mm Aden guns. It did have its brief moment of glory. Test pilot Mike Lithgow took the Swift to Libya and set a new world absolute speed record of 737.7 miles per hour. "150 were ordered, and the first were hurried into service with 56 Squadron, with dire results. There were serious rifts between the government and the RAF, which were to affect future projects. The supersonic aircraft that the Royal Air Force was eventually to receive was the Lightning, made by the English Electric Company. It was to have a big influence on and to act as chase aircraft to one of Britain's most costly cancellations, the TSR-2. There was, not for the first time, confusion in the RAF and the Air Ministry. To some in 1957, it looked as though the age of the manned fighter and bomber was over. War, it seemed, would be waged with missiles. Not a view likely to endear itself to senior officers, most of whom were ex-pilots. The RAF issued a specification GOR 339 for an integrated weapons system, a multi-role aircraft on American lines. Had it been left to one company, this story might have been different. But the government of the time was desperate to force through an amalgamation of the fragmented aircraft industry. There were 8 major manufacturers and numerous smaller ones. Memories of the Swift were still fresh, so committees were set up to oversee the project. The English Electric Company produced a design, the P-17, which was a logical step up from the Lightning. But the passion for integration meant that the design work went to the teams at Vickers and Supermarine. In the end, the aircraft they produced, the TSR-2, bore an uncanny resemblance to the P-17. 9 development aircraft were ordered from the consortium at a cost of £92 million. By 1963, the cost had risen to £198 million. In March 1964, the aircraft was moved to Boscombe Down, Great Britain's main aircraft evaluation centre, in preparation for its first flight. The cost was now in excess of £500 million. Ronald Beeman took the plane on its first flight. All seemed well. The press were pleased. And then a rival appeared in the shape of the American General Dynamics F-111. Great pressure was put on the British government to buy the plane. It had been presented to them with an overestimate of its performance and an underestimate of its cost. On April 6, 1965, Budget Day, the Chancellor, James Callaghan, announced the cancellation of the TSR-2. So the RAF purchased the F-111, itself to suffer from enormous development problems, and in the end to cost the British taxpayer more than the TSR-2. The worst blow was to the morale of the industry. Great Britain had lost not just an aeroplane, but the chance to remain at the forefront of world aviation. In 1937, Major Mayo had come up with the idea of a composite aircraft, the Short Mayo. The idea was for the host aircraft to assist with the takeoff and initial climb, and then return to base. Both aircraft were flying boats, the host plane based on Short's highly regarded Empire flying boat. For this was the era of seaborne aircraft. Post-war, in Britain, they built the Princess, another glorious failure. By the time it was built, the flying boat was coming to its end, beaten by the new city airports and the faster jet transports. Even so, Saunders Roe had plans for the P-192, which was to have 24 jet engines and carry 1,000 passengers. In 1942, Lord Brabazon, holder of flying license number 1, chaired a committee to look into the future of civil aviation. One of the planned aircraft was to be named after him.
The Brabazon first flew in August 1949. It was the biggest aeroplane ever made in England, and the idea of it was to fly the Atlantic non-stop with 100 passengers traveling in super comfort.
Work went ahead with the inevitable committees to design the aircraft. British Overseas Airways Corporation confused the situation by saying that 100 seats were far too many, and they were looking to just 25.
Brabazon, of course, brought with it terrific development of the works at Filton. First of all, we built a hangar which would accommodate 3 of them, and that's still in use and has been used for many aeroplanes since. And of course, it has put Filton on the map for big aeroplanes. And likewise, we built a runway of over 8,000 feet long and 100 yards wide. This caused a bit of local stir because we had to knock down a village to do it.
Bill Pegg was chosen as chief test pilot, and a full-size wooden mock-up was built at Filton, and work began on the prototype. It was to be the first aircraft in the world to have fully powered controls. A full-scale hydraulic test rig was built, which gave Bill Pegg some idea of what to expect. Although on one occasion, the elevators on the rig went down for no apparent reason. Had it happened in flight, it would have been the end of the Brabazon. Clearly, further work was needed on the elevators.
And we developed those on a Lancaster bomber on the elevator. And we flew that for about a year or so before we flew the aeroplane. And of course the engines, which you see behind me here, the Centaurus, we've flown in lots of aeroplanes and we were well accustomed to those.
The Brabazon was to have 8 engines, 2 to each of the contra-rotating propellers. Later models were planned with turboprops. The Brabazon was finally moved out of its hangar with only inches to spare. It was undeniably a very beautiful craft. And after a year of ground testing, preparations were made for its first flight.
Bill Pegg flew the aeroplane in '49, and I fortunately was chosen to be the second pilot, and I became the second captain after 20 hours. meant to fly that day. We taxied it up and down the runway a couple of times, and then we decided to take it off. And of course, it was a terrific advance, because I've said that the aeroplane weighed 300,000 pounds, and the biggest aeroplane prior to that was about a Lincoln bomber, which was about 70,000 pounds. So it was 3 times as heavy as anything that had flown. And of course, the big thing, having that it had that enormous wingspan, so that it could do the Atlantic non-stop. Because prior to that, only the big flying boats could do it from America to England, and nobody could do it from England to America because of the headwinds.
Despite the apparent success of the first flight, the government decided that the aircraft was outdated. The project was to be cancelled, at a cost of over £6.5 million. The plane was broken up for scrap and sold for just £10,000. All that remains today are 2 wheels and a piece of the fuselage in a Bristol museum.
The old girl was a bit slow and cumbersome, wasn't she? To get her up to 25,000 feet was a day's out here, wasn't it?
Well, it took about nearly an hour. But it got up there, and actually it did its design speed of 250 at 25,000. But it did take a time to get there. It was really all set for going 5,000 miles once it got there.
The Brabazon had been the victim of the committee's inability to assess the future of air travel. It was designed for a bygone age when only a few, a rich few, travelled on the airlines.
But I remember they used to give us big boxes of food.
Yeah, that's right.
And little flasks of coffee that had a pressing cork.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
And of course, when we went up to any altitude unpressurised,
yes,
the first thing that happened, that cork came out. And do you remember Johnny Hayman,
yes,
who was the engineer in those days? I think he feathered all 8 engines at one occasion. I mean, we took her up to Prestwick, didn't we?
Yes, yes, we went to Prestwick. That was the great day when coming into land of Prestwick, we hit a flock of starlings.
That's it, yeah.
And the whole windscreen was covered in dead starlings, which had made it very exciting at about 100 feet. However, it landed. Actually, it was an easy aeroplane to land and very comfortable to land. Having such a large wing, you got down to about 20 feet, and there was a terrific air cushion ground effect between the wing and thing, and it could sit down very smoothly. In fact, it was so smooth that we had a light on the dashboard which showed when the main wheels touched, because if you did a good land, you couldn't feel the main wheels touching.
We were a bit low on rudder, though, weren't we?
No, I think it was right. No, that was all right.
They certainly overdid it on the Britannia. I never
yes,
followed.
They
made sure we had plenty on that one. An awful lot of people have said a lot was learned from the Brabazon that went into the Britannia, but do you wholly support this, Walter?
Oh, I think so, yes.
It was largely a different concept, though, wasn't it?
Oh, totally different concept, but a lot of the structure and the technical know-how went into it an awful lot, yes.
The Britannia became the first airliner to fly the Atlantic non-stop both ways. It had a successful career both with the airlines and RAF's Transport Command, and went some way to vindicate the Brabazon. Bristol then embarked on an experimental aircraft, the Model 188. It had been intended by the ministry as a flying engine test bed. The 188 was expected to encounter temperatures of 300 degrees centigrade. In view of this, it was decided to make the basic airframe of stainless steel. This involved the company in a whole new field of construction. A mock-up was made of the aircraft and used by test pilot Godfrey Orty for familiarization. By now, the aircraft was also to be used to explore the effects of kinetic heating and the development of future supersonic projects. The 188 was rolled out for its first flight in April 1961. The problem was with the plane's endurance, which was only 25 minutes, although it once stayed airborne for 48. It was, as Orty said, by airline standards of fuel reserves, in emergency situation at takeoff. It flew just a total of 25 hours. There were the usual photographs, even an appearance at the Farnborough Air Show, before the project was scrapped at a cost of £21 million. But the work that had been done with the 188, the Handley Page low-speed aircraft, and the Olympus test-bed Vulcan were to lead to an Anglo-French success. In the United States, the Lockheed Corporation had been working on a supersonic transport, or SST aircraft, as had Boeing. This time, it was the Americans who had problems with government and a project cancelled. The conclusion was that at this stage, a civil SST was not an economic proposition. The Russians, too, had been working on their own SST, the Tu-144. In 1973, one of the prototypes broke up in mid-air at the Paris Air Show. The cause of the crash was never revealed, but the plane was withdrawn after only 10 months in service. So out of the Brabazon's old hangar came the Concorde. Itself nearly cancelled, it went on not just to pioneer high-speed passenger flight, but European cooperation in aviation. One of the Brabazon Committee's other recommendations had been for a medium-haul jet airliner. This turned out to be the Comet. Despite the early tragic setbacks, it went on to serve with airlines around the world. the RAF's Transport Command ordered Mark IVs to serve in the Far and Middle East. They also ordered a maritime patrol version, the Nimrod, to replace the aging piston-engined Shackleton. Then came the need for upgrading Great Britain's airborne early warning radar, and a new variant of the Nimrod was born. It was doomed to be yet another project cancelled. Caught between the needs of the RAF, the Ministry of Defence and the Treasury, it had cost the British taxpayer £800 million. The problem had nothing to do with the aircraft, despite it having been in service for nearly 40 years, but with the radar system.
Rob 6TD, intercept and engage, Baker 601 with mission 45. Copy.
Numerous attempts were made to get it right, but in the end, the RAF bought the American AWACS based on the Boeing 707, something they'd wanted in the first place, over 10 years before.
For Great Britain, the Nimrod AEW was probably the last real project cancelled. As we moved into the 90s, the use of computer-aided design eliminated much of the human error that had previously existed, and political decisions were made long before any major financial damage could be done. Even then, extensive testing followed, which eliminated anything the computers had overlooked. Scientific trials have continued, but such projects have tended to be behind closed doors and only come to light as successes, if indeed that's what they are. But one major development in America in the late 80s that did show great promise has indeed been cancelled. Sikorsky's revolutionary X-Wing, that was being developed to fulfill the requirements of NASA's 21st century designs, was centered around a new rotor system which would overcome the high-speed limitations of today's helicopters in a remarkable way. Prototype testing had already begun on this futuristic machine that tried to combine attributes of both helicopter and aeroplane. The intention was that the rotors would perform as normal in vertical flight, but then transform into a conventional wing surface for forward movement. The aircraft actually flew as a conventional helicopter, but before any practical test flights could determine the viability of the wing transformation, NASA, under financial pressure and suffering from a series of other setbacks, cancelled the project. Today, restarting the trial is apparently cost-prohibitive. An indication, perhaps, that the new designers and scientists of 21st century aviation, through the ever-advancing technologies, must get it right, long before it ever leaves the confines of the computer.